Well, good day to everyone joining us and welcome to today's X-Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Leveraging Payer Intelligence in Patient Support Programs. My name is Andrew Jernan and I'll be your X-Talks host for today. And today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes, and this presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. And this webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars really work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit your questions and your comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. And this chat box is located in the control panel that's on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you need any assistance, you can contact me at any time by sending a message using that chat panel. And at this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. And please note that this event will be recorded and made available to you for future streaming on xtalks.com. And at this point, I'd like to thank TrialCard, who helped develop the content for this presentation. TrialCard Incorporated provides patient affordability, medication access and adherence, patient support, and clinical trial services on behalf of pharmaceutical manufacturers. Founded in 2000, TrialCard has connected nearly 33 million patients with over 15 billion in branded drug savings to date. The company is headquartered in Morrisville, North Carolina. And another thanks goes to Policy Reporter. Now, in November 2019, TrialCard acquired Policy Reporter, a Bellingham, Washington-based healthcare information management company specializing in increasing patient access to pharmaceuticals, biologics, medical devices, and diagnostic testing. The acquisition accelerates TrialCard's mission to create the leading end-to-end patient access solutions organization by granting its clients increased visibility into health plan policy information for their products. All right, well now I'd like to introduce you to your speakers for today's webinar. Rick Ford, who joined TrialCard in 2017, advises pharmaceutical and biotech drug manufacturers on market access and patient advocacy matters. He's managed patient service functions for drug manufacturers and has held positions as high as vice president for the nation's largest specialty pharmacies. Ford has extensive experience in oncology, having worked at US Oncology, and he has also advised medical and pharmacy benefit administrators on the development of specialty drug programs designed to serve health plan members. Ford has over 30 years of experience in the healthcare industry. Your second speaker for today, Eric Willis, is a talented and accomplished management professional with wide-ranging experience in project management, client relations, operations, and departmental direction. Now, Eric joined the TrialCard team in 2012, overseeing one of the company's longest-running programs in support of subcutaneous injectable drugs. Eric's skill at understanding his clients' problems and offering timely and actionable recommendations led to his promotion to the role of executive program manager in support, of TrialCard's largest client. And in his current role as VP of Product Management, Eric provides consultative advice to clients on best practices for designing programs that drive both access and long-term adherence. And finally, Drew Gutschmidt founded Policy Reporter, having recognized a need for real-time data in the market access space. In the consulting field, Drew worked with some of the largest Fortune 500 medical device and pharmaceutical companies, as well as smaller manufacturers launching new therapeutics or devices. He helped support brand launches and helped to provide vital market research to bring therapies to patients. And since founding Policy Reporter in 2012, Drew has grown the company to almost 100 staff and has helped the company become the leader in real-time payer intelligence for manufacturers, payers, and providers. And since Policy Reporter's acquisition by TrialCard, as I mentioned, in November of 2019, Drew continues to lead Policy Reporter as president. All right, well, without further ado, I'd like to hand the microphone over and presentation over to your first speaker for today, and that's Rick Ford. Rick.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you all for your attendance. Today, we're going to be talking about leveraging payer intelligence in the operation of patient support programs. The agenda and learning objectives for today define payer intelligence and how it's used in the support of these programs. We're going to walk through the processes we use at TrialCard to apply patient service programs and payer intelligence to achieve great patient outcomes, and then talk about some of the case studies, how this has been done, and the successes that can be realized using payer intelligence. What is payer intelligence? Well, certainly within the context of patient support programs, payer intelligence is all of the processes and procedures that health plans use to administer benefits for their members. This can include coverage policy, payment policies, required access channels like mandatory use of specialty pharmacies and others, the processes for requesting coverage. Essentially, it is the payer level processes that payers use to administer coverage, really not individual plan benefits. That is specific to each plan that a payer administers, but really the payer level processes. How do patients benefit from the use of payer intelligence? Payer intelligence has gotten very complex, and really to properly advocate for the interests of patients, it's important that hub programs be able to access this information, use it on a real-time basis so that patients can receive their prescribed therapy in the shortest amount of time possible. It's important to understand that a contract for health benefits has evolved substantially in the past few decades. Certainly, that's true for both insurance plans and self-funded plans. Self-funded plans are very complex in that they have the opportunity to set many of their own parameters. A contract for health benefits will literally run itself for many, sometimes 20, 30, 40 pages, and then incorporate thousands of other documents that are published and available through payer intelligence reporting systems. These are typically publicly available policies, and transparency has become very important in the world of health plans, and publicly available documents are important to that transparency. Coverage policy, as I said, site of care policies, all of these are largely publicly available documents. When pursuing patient interests and doing what we call patient advocacy, it is important to understand at what point we're requesting coverage. That's extremely important to the process of performing patient advocacy functions and operating patient support programs. Prior plan approval is typically what we call processes that health plans require before a service is covered. On the outpatient side, this can be prior authorization. Inpatient is typically referred to as pre-certification. Certain health plans have their own names for these processes. Medi-Cal uses treatment authorization request, or we call them TARs. But all of these are processes that health plans require be completed before services are rendered and claims are billed. But there's been a movement on the health plan side to eliminate much of this. Health plans are publishing their coverage policy, specifying how processes for coverage are administered, and then from there, the health plan says it's the responsibility of the patient and the provider to understand their health coverage and to make sure that they proceed appropriately. So what that means is that coverage is not determined until a claim is processed. And that puts a great amount of burden on a patient and a provider to understand the documents we're talking about and really to access them on a current basis. Medical necessity is in the coverage policy that is published by a health plan, and it's extremely important to ensuring that understanding medical policy and making sure that patients get the benefits they're entitled to. Medical necessity is one of two components of coverage policy. There are the clinical requirements of coverage policy, and then there are the administrative requirements of coverage policy. And it's important to look at them separately. Medical necessity includes the components that are here. It may include other components, but it's essentially the process by which health plans determine that a service is medically necessary and will be covered on that basis. Typically, that's what prior plan approval does. It determines medical necessity. The second part of a coverage policy is the administrative requirements. These are very, very different from clinical requirements. They don't determine medical necessity, but they set the terms and conditions under which medically necessary services will be rendered. A good example of an administrative requirement is a health plan may walk through and list all of the therapies that are approved for the treatment of a disease, say first line for multiple sclerosis or inflammatory diseases, but then we'll designate a few of those, maybe as few as one, as the preferred drug because it represents the least cost alternative. Administrative requirements and clinical requirements come together and need to be understood to make sure patients have good access to their benefits. Coverage policy may require treatment at a specific site of care, and access to the drug via a specific benefit plan may be required. A drug may be assigned, say, to the pharmacy benefit plan or to the medical benefit plan, and those are the benefits that are applied. So these are all the circumstances that are understood through payer intelligence, the thousands of documents that are published by health plans that are accessed to advocate for patients, and it's very important for those documents to be understood. What we do in patient support programs is provide the resources that are typically either not available or very stretched at the provider level to understand and pursue a prior authorization or a coverage request for treatment. So patient support programs fill an important need, particularly in the evolving health plan environment. This next section is a section on how TrialCard applies payer intelligence to the operation of its patient service programs. Eric Willis is going to talk about how we do that. Eric designs the processes that our hub programs use, including the integration of payer intelligence, and goes through the training that our staff members receive to use our payer intelligence system and apply it to our patient access programs. Eric?
Thank you, Rick, and again, thank you all for joining us this afternoon. This is always exciting as we get to work through different innovative solutions to benefit patient support programs and the way that we're able to apply new technology and intelligent solutions to better support our clients and patients. As we think about utilizing payer intelligence within the operations of these programs, the first step is always obtaining the access to the data within Policy Reporter for agents involved in performing the services. The tools available within Policy Reporter allows agents to gain access, review, and download coverage documentation and data that is valuable to inform agents as they are working through the processes of different services provided within a patient support services program. As we utilize the data available in most patient supports programs, is a straightforward path to obtain relevant data for case research. You can see on the screen areas and fields that we pull out and are able to utilize within our enrollment forms and enrollment processes to search the Policy Reporter database for relevant pieces of data and relevant coverage documents. The clinical policy bulletin that you see here is an example of the type of documents that we're able to pull out and utilize from within Policy Reporter. These different areas that we're able to search through, we search through with diagnosis and prescription, as well as their insurance information. This provides us with the necessary information to search the Policy Reporter and receive relevant output to enhance the services, the performance on services provided. Benefit investigations, prior authorizations, and appeals are all areas that benefit from this type of information. We find that having the information readily at hand to call prior to calling the payers allows for a much smoother process, as you are able to guide the process to the information you need. As you can see, the Policy Reporter interface is a simple search interface that allows us to utilize it with minimal information around the product information and the health insurance information that then provides back those documents. It pulls up the relevant documents for our agents to be better informed when working through our services. We can then attach these documents as reference points in our return information to the site offices. So as you look at here, you see the different types of benefits as we see these different access points. It's an easy keyword search that filters the documents by product and payer. That allows us to really zone in and key in on the different documents that we are able to utilize and manage. It's the real-time monitoring of the policies ensures that we are current in our coverage data. One of the areas that we find often is that as our agents search in their case research portions of the process, that they're often having to search through many different disjointed search functions, whether it's on payer sites or Google searches or whichever way, and understanding which ones are current and effective or hard in situations like that. And so Policy Reporter allows us to have this in a single scenarios where you can always see the most recent documents of coverage bulletins, prior authorization forms, prior authorization criteria, etc. It increases the prescriber's confidence when we attach these policies to this. All of these are downloadable forms that we're able to attach then the resource document that we're using to justify and put back into that place for the summary of benefit documents. Those allow us to really give the credence and show the backup support that the doctors are going to need for reference purposes, and understanding that, combining that with like prior authorization documentation, prior authorization criteria and forms allows for actionable next steps to be taken as well. Reducing the agent's research time is key as well. One area that is often, as we are talking, as I talk with different clients, you don't often see just a good research time done in the benefit investigations and prior auth areas. And many of that is because it's honestly just too hard in some cases for people to really put that forth that time and effort. This allows for us to really streamline that approach and give the most effective use of time prior to where we're not just on where your agents are not just on hold, but they're able to actually have the documentation at hand in order to utilize that information. And then, as it says at the end, we're also able to really streamline and be productive on the phone calls. Having information in front of us is not something that that really deters the payers as we're talking to them. It allows for people to understand that we're able to really have a very precise conversation because we're getting information and we're verifying information that we have, but then also just getting the information that we don't have. And that allows for a very precise conversation. It's the best use of all parties' times and really creates just a seamless interaction across the entire process. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Drew, who's going to speak more about how we customize the coverage dashboards within Policy Reporter.
Thank you, Eric. So what I'd like to talk about next is an additional layer of operational efficiency. Here at Policy Reporter, we take what is unstructured data, unstructured policy data, and we put that into a structured form in what we call a coverage dashboard. And this allows hub agents or patient support staff or clinicians to view that key criteria in a consistent and easy to access format. And so once again, it starts with the patient enrollment form, where we're able to look at that insurance information from the patient, that clinical information from the patient enrollment form, pair that together, and input that into a customized dashboard. So what we can see on the next screen here is just an example of what one of those dashboards might look like. And so, oh, thank you. You can input the patient's insurance information, the particular therapeutic, specify the state, and then what you get returned is structured coverage criteria. That includes medical necessity criteria, prior authorization criteria, step therapy, diagnosis requirements, documentation requirements, both the clinical criteria and the administrative requirements, like Rick was talking about earlier, in an easy to view dashboard format. And so this avoids the need to look through what can be a 100-page document to get at this criteria. What we see next is an example of what those policies might look like. This happens to be a step therapy policy, but it could be a medical policy, a prior authorization criteria, a prior authorization form. In fact, we find in lieu of policy, prior authorization forms have a lot of key criteria that we're able to take out and put in a structured format. And by having that in a structured format, we're also able to view, sort, and export that information. What we see on the next screen here is an example of what an exported version of that might look like. It's a coverage summary that could be attached to a summary of benefits, or it could be sent directly to a physician's office. And so you can imagine having this information in a structured format, easy to view format, provides a number of benefits. It allows the hub agents or patient support staff to avoid having to look through what can be a 100-page coverage policy. It also allows them to have that relevant eligibility criteria right at their fingertips. Okay. And so this presents the information in a more organized and structured form. It allows you to get at therapeutic specific information. You might have a multi-drug document, like a multiple sclerosis document that covers multiple therapeutics. And rather than having to look through that document, pull out the particular therapeutic, pull out the relevant criteria to that therapeutic, through a coverage dashboard, you're able to select that therapeutic and view the relevant criteria, relevant clinical and administrative criteria without having to sort through those documents. So this obviously speeds up the ability for an agent to check eligibility and for patient support staff to check eligibility. It reduces the need to contact the payer as often. It doesn't necessarily remove that need entirely, but by having that information at your fingertips, you're able to check eligibility criteria without having to place that call as often. It provides a more efficient and effective live support experience by having that information readily available and being able to answer questions right on the phone. And then finally, and probably most importantly, it improves the speed to therapy for a patient, speeding up the eligibility checks, reducing claim denials by having accurate information and having access to that information in a timely fashion. So I'd like to pass it back to Eric to talk a bit about how we can take some of the structured data and pair it up on our backend systems to have a better integration between payer intelligence and a patient support platform.
Thanks, Drew. Appreciate that. So as we look forward in the advancement of our integrations, we look at the interoperability of within the case management systems for use in the patient support programs. The ability to insert this data tool into the system of record that the agents are interacting with will yield greater returns in efficiency and accuracy for our patients, providers, and clients. How would this look? So in case where you see this, you see over to the left right now, you still see the enrollment forms that started. It still starts there because that's how we start with any of our data gathering processes, is with the first enrollments that are received. It's a consistent foundation for obtaining the information needed in those searches. So as we saw in the earlier ones, we're able to take that data and populate it into the Policy Reporter search engines. As we're looking at these forwards now, we don't even have to move out of the case management system for the search. So in this case, you see QuickPath, which is our proprietary case management system. We're able to utilize the fields that we previously identified and through API connections and search the data in a service call. This allows for Policy Reporter to then process through defined algorithms to identify and present the most relevant data and documents back to the user. As you can see, areas like this would allow for a lot of different options to be able to combine that with other service calls, through whether that's e-services or different areas, to give a full picture of it, of the coverage determination process, prior authorization processes and needs, prior and or without even having to make a call to the payers in those cases. It allows us to populate the majority of that data needed to send coverage determination back to the receiving agents with one click, with moving into those workflows, and is able to then process a truly automated and real-time process throughout this. Bringing this together into one system allows us to apply any of the others automated, as we talked about, through these other automated services to complete. This allows us to really fill in the blanks and fill in the pieces of the puzzles to create the most efficient and accurate processes for our patient support programs. Go ahead and go to the next slide. And as you can see, this brings all of these documents back together for the benefits of these programs. And so what are our benefits that we see in these different areas? We see these as benefits through the agents work entirely in one platform, in just the patient support programs platform. It allows them to be able to be effective in focusing in and not changing back through the different workflows that they have. It allows for one source of documentation as one source of record, and allows for for us to have a very consistent approach to having relevant data on each case and documentation to see when communications go out in different areas through that standpoint. It improves the control, productivity, and speed to therapy, which in short really shows that this improves the entire journey throughout the patient support program life, which gives a better experience for our patients, for our providers, for our clients, which ultimately does lead to the better experience on the product as a whole. So as we move on through these next few ones, we're going to kick this back over to Rick Ford now and Drew both, who will be taking us through a couple of case studies here in the patient advocacy areas.
Yeah, thank you very much, both Eric and Drew. This is Rick. What we're going to talk about in this section really are some of the higher level applications of payer intelligence. Eric walked us through the processes of using payer intelligence in the regular duties of a patient service program, receiving patient referrals, accessing the plan information for those referrals, using that to develop a summary of benefits that is in turn provided back to the prescriber, or in the case where the patient service program is authorized to present prior authorizations to the plan, using that information to ensure that the coverage request that's presented is compliant with the terms and conditions of coverage. And again, as I stated early in the presentation, there are both clinical and administrative requirements in the terms and conditions of coverage spread out through thousands of pages of documents. And it's really the system that Eric showed you that allows us to move through all of those documents, to use intelligent processes to search those documents, and then ensure that the coverage request, when it's submitted to the plan, presents the clinical circumstances that are required for coverage, could be specific diagnosis codes, prior treatment requirements, whatever clinical circumstances are important to that case, and then also show how the patient's condition and circumstances are compliant with all of the coverage requirements. When we get into the higher levels of use of payer intelligence, what I'm really talking about here is patient advocacy. When a coverage request has been presented to the health plan and denied, then we're really in a circumstance where we need to use payer intelligence to either contest the decision that's been made, or I think in many cases, appropriately document the case so that it can be understood by the health plan in terms of their requirements for coverage. When we think about the appeals process and the opportunities we have to advocate for patients who have been denied coverage for services, there's different processes that are important. Health plans allow a limited level of appeals within the context of the plan. There may be a level 1, a level 2 appeal. That is really the patient's opportunity within the health plan to review the circumstances of their own case, look at the terms and conditions of coverage, and cooperate with whoever may be the prescriber, the hub service program, who's ever going to submit that appeal. What is extremely important to understand is that the contract for benefits in almost all cases, including Medicare, puts the responsibility for making a coverage request on the health plan member. That is not a responsibility, with a few exceptions, typically in HMOs, but very frequently in the vast majority of cases, the patient is responsible for the coverage request. And therefore, it's important to make sure that the patient has full access to payer intelligence when that's made. Once you expire the health plan's opportunity for appeal, there are outside appeals processes. Talk about the ERO, or External Review Organization, process that is made available to members of ACA regulated health plans, typically commercial health plans, as specified by the Affordable Care Act. There are both state and federal ERO processes. Certain states have their own processes. Other states use the federal process. The federal process is administered by Maximus. Decisions made by Maximus are final. You have one opportunity, and it works a lot like the jury system. Nobody within the ERO process can ask questions. Information is presented to them, and they're asked to do something very specific. ERO will only address medical necessity and termination from the health plan. They will not address all of the other grievances that a patient may have. It's extremely important to submit a package to external review that is complete, has all of the health plan's terms and conditions of coverage that are relevant to the case documented, show how the case complies with the terms and conditions of coverage. If the terms and conditions of coverage are unreasonable, then to clearly demonstrate that. Sometimes that requires industry level documents to show what is reasonable within the conduct of health plans. And when you come out of ERO, the decision is binding. It is binding on the claimant, and then it's binding on the health plan. There is no further appeal. It's extremely important that it be made properly. For Medicare, the level 2 appeal, there are additional levels of appeal, but they become extremely cumbersome to pursue. The level 2 appeal is made by a contractor that is different from the contractor that received the initial request for coverage and did the level 1 appeal. That level 2 appeal is a chance for a new set of eyes. But again, remember, in many cases, they don't have the prior information. So it's very important to give that QIC, or qualified independent contractor, a complete picture of the case. There is Department of Insurance. Department of Insurance is available to about the 35–40% of commercial health plan members that hold insurance coverage versus a self-funded plan. Department of Insurance is more interactive. You can work with the department to understand the case. You can go back and forth. They're much more friendly than some of these other processes that are very, very structured. We'll look at a case here. It was a case that I was involved with. This was a case where we had to apply payer intelligence extensively on behalf of a patient that had a legitimate grievance with their health plan, and in all fairness, was not being treated properly. This particular patient was receiving a drug for self-administered use. It was an injectable therapy, and the payer had given certain instructions to their provider network on how to bill for these services, and the instructions they had given for completing the claim form and reporting the services were let me just say, misaligned with the industry. The patient ended up being disadvantaged by this process, was paying more out of pocket than was reasonable, and we ended up with the case in the hub, trying to understand how we could benefit this patient. What we did was we were able to use payer intelligence systems to look across health plans. It included looking at the Medicare supplier manual, because Medicare pays for self-administered injectable drugs through the DME Max. There are commercial health plans that document their processes, and we were able to put together a complete picture of how this particular health plan was adjusting claims for this member and how they were treated unfairly. We chose to present the grievance to the Department of Insurance because this person had an insured health plan, and it was outside the scope of ERO. ERO, it was not an issue of medical necessity. It was not an issue of termination of benefits. It was an issue of fair treatment. As the result of documenting these, the Department of Insurance made an inquiry with the health plan. The health plan reversed itself, and it was the department's position that the health plan was inconsistent with the industry and how it was administering benefits for this patient. It was really a great application of payer intelligence, because it's very unlikely that we would have identified and found all of the relevant documents for this case simply by going through the web and looking for different documents. One of the great benefits of a system that organizes payer intelligence, presents it to an agent, and allows that agent to search a data is that you have controlled access. Sending agents or patient advocates out to the wide world of the web and hoping they come back with relevant information is not necessarily a process with great internal controls. The systems that organize and present this information to agents allow this work to be done with a great level of insight. The next case Drew is going to talk about, this is a case that we documented and that deals with a very extensive medical policy for drug coverage.
Thank you, Rick. So I spoke earlier about how these policy documents can be long and onerous. And so we pulled an example of an Aetna policy for multiple sclerosis. It's a 114-page policy covering multiple therapeutics. It lists out quite clearly the step therapy requirements to try and fail 2 preferred therapeutics before a third, more costly therapeutic can be prescribed and covered. And for those of you familiar with step therapy policy, this is very common criteria. But what I wanted to pull out of this 114-page document is that it has an exception to that step therapy requirement, that those patients with a needle phobia that are diagnosed and meet certain criteria can actually skip that step therapy requirement and move on to a therapeutic that may be more costly, but for them maybe lead to better health outcomes. And by being buried in a 114-page policy, this means that a clinician could miss this particular exception and prescribe for the patient a more conventional covered oral therapy that may be not as well tolerated by the patient. And so this is an example of where being able to pull out relevant criteria out of a 114-page document and have that accessible to both patient support staff, hub agents, and clinicians and within the physician office allows potentially for better patient health outcomes by being able to pair up the relevant criteria with the patient population that as specified within the policy. And so, we pulled this example. It's obviously a very, very long policy example, but even a policy that is a dozen pages or 20 pages, it can be difficult for an agent or patient support staff to find the relevant criteria, and things can be missed, which can hurt patient health outcomes.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for that. Lots of insights there for everyone, lots of useful information. Like I said, I'd like now to start the Q&A period, ask the audience to continue sending in their questions and comments right now using the questions window. This, of course, is the Q&A session, and we've got some questions here already. So our first question is, do the documents that payers publish tell us how much patient copays are? So I'll leave that open to the floor.
Yeah, absolutely. I can take that question. Unless Eric, do you want to hop in there?
No, go ahead, Drew.
Okay, thank you. So what we look at Policy Reporter as it relates to patient copay on the pharmaceutical benefit are your formulary documents. Your formulary documents specify a particular tier, which relates back to patient copay and cost share, but it doesn't specify the specific cost share that an individual patient on a specific plan may be incurring. So we'll look at tiers across plan types and across specific formulary documents, but we don't actually pull in the specific patient cost share information.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that. Let's move to another question here. Is Policy Reporter able to access and provide preferred status with PBMs? Drew, any insights on that?
Absolutely. So PBMs are obviously an extremely important entity within the benefit management space. Benefit managers are publishing criteria that apply to a huge number of covered lives. So we look at pharmaceutical benefit managers' policies and formularies and incorporate that information alongside specific health plan documents that are published. And so looking at preferred status is one of the criteria that we look at, but we'll also look at prior authorization criteria. As I mentioned before, we'll look at formulary status and tier status and other restrictions. But PBMs are an extremely important entity in the health system, and they do represent a huge number of covered lives. So their documents in particular are quite important.
And if I could add on very briefly to that, the prior authorization criteria that are published by the PBMs that do show the preferred statuses as well as the non-preferred status gives a great amount of information in the patient support programs when we are determining kind of how to address different cases. And so that information is very available within Policy Reporter and is a huge benefit to the program operations.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you both for that. Another question here, does Policy Reporter capture product and plan specific prior authorization forms and criteria? And if so, how could that information be used to streamline the reimbursement process? Eric, I'll give that one over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, it does capture both the product and plan specific prior authorizations forms where those are published. Many times there are also therapeutic class prior authorization forms and criteria that provide the same and needed information for all the specific products within that therapeutic class. But we are able to get the specific information needed in order to pass that on. Being able to really, as that streamlines the reimbursement process, what it does is it really gives us access to both the criteria up front to where we can give very accurate and relevant information back to the healthcare providers who are needing this information, as well as any forms that that they are needed to submit with the documentation that is appropriate for that case. So having that all in one place, rather than having to go search that out or wait on somebody to email that to us from a payer, whichever way to get that, really does make it a much more efficient process for our agents to work through.
We've got another question here coming from the audience. How does Policy Reporter pull unstructured data like product names and billing codes from payer documents into structured searchable database fields? Drew, that's probably a great question for you.
Sure, thanks. So we use a combination of patented software technology combined with human intelligence. And our patented software tracks policy documents. Certain types of documents we also parse out structured information and store that within our database. And we also have a team of policy analysts that will add that additional human intelligence component and both interpret those policy documents as well as pull out additional structured data and make that accessible.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much for that. Reminder to the audience, you can send in questions using the questions chat box on your control panel, but we've got definitely a couple more lined up here. Next question, if a plan is self-funded, where does the member submit an appeal?
Yeah, so it's very important in patient advocacy and the operation of patient support programs to understand the grievance processes that are available to patients. Insurance plans, certainly patients can go to the insurance department. In a self-funded plan, you have to expire the health plan's internal appeals processes. Then you can go to external review. As I said, external review will only review medical necessity and termination from a health plan. Any other matter is referred to the Department of Labor. The Department of Labor is not somewhere you want to go with a health plan complaint. So to the extent possible, it benefits a self-funded member with any matter that can't be addressed by ERO to work those out with their plan. But ultimately, you can make a labor complaint to the Department of Labor.
All right, excellent. Thank you for that one. Probably another question here for you, Rick. If the health plan is insurance, does the member always file an appeal with the state where he or she lives?
If you have an insured health plan, there will be a home state. Through an employer, a group health plan will have a home state. It's typically the employer's state where they are headquartered, but some plans find friendly states to file and use as the home state for their health plan. So it is important to find out which state the plan is domiciled in, because just because you live in Georgia does not mean your company health plan is domiciled in Georgia or that you have access to the Georgia Department of Insurance. So that's extremely important because you can lose a lot of time complaining to the wrong insurance department.
Right, right. Okay, thank you for that. Move to another question here. How can Policy Reporter data be used for assessing brand performance or positioning? If at all possible, is it through the number of policies covering the product? Maybe Drew, is that a good question for you?
Sure, I'll start off with that question, and Rick, feel free to hop in and add your insights. It's an interesting question. How do you assess brand performance or positioning? From a policy perspective, we take a look at measures what we call relative coverage. So we look at baseline coverage and restrictions that could be FDA label, or it could be above FDA label, and it could be some additional restrictions that we specify with a client. And then we'll rate a policy, or we'll rate a coverage position for a payer to that baseline, so that across the board, clients can see where does a payer fit within this baseline of restrictions. And so that can be a very effective way to look across the payer landscape and see how policies fit from a restrictiveness level, from a patient access perspective, without having to read through every single policy. I think also, part of the question here is, does the number of policies impact? And I think what's important to note is, when you're looking at, for example, buy and bill therapeutic, where the physician's taking on a lot of that financial risk with prescribing that therapeutic, policy can have an impact on prescription volumes by having a published policy that gives the prescriber more confidence in that buy and bill drug. And so for certain therapeutics, the number of policies, I would say, is a measure of how likely it is that a prescriber is going to be confident in a buy and bill drug. But outside of buy and bill, I think that, for us, the relative restrictive rating has been a very effective way to look across the policy landscape and how restrictions and criteria compare. Rick, anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I would say the first case we talked about where we accumulated payer policy information on behalf of an individual case. Sometimes, and certainly I've done a lot of work with payers on their policies and circumstances that manufacturers found to be, I don't necessarily want to say unreasonable, but certainly unusual. In certain very complex therapies, including immune deficiency and others, to go across the policy landscape, document what is evolving as a coverage standards, put those together for a payer marketing team so that when they go in and visit with the payer, they really have a good picture of payer intelligence as it pertains to the landscape for the drugs that they are marketing, and to show what the current state of coverage standards are so that the health plan has something to sit down with and reconsider without simply being presented with the judgment of the manufacturer. It's always helpful to have their peer information available and to help them become consistent with their peers in the way that they cover drugs.
Noted. All right. Thanks for that. Maybe one last question here. How complete is the list of the brands and products? Does this list only cover those brands for which patient services are supported by TrialCard? Eric, any insights there on that question?
Yeah, no, this is not limited to just the brands that are supported by TrialCard. Policy Reporter has really established a pretty comprehensive database of drugs out there to be able to really support. So it is not just limited to ours. Drew, you may, if you want to elaborate a little more on the specifics of counts and such, please do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so our data set encompasses all policy that's published by payers across your pharmaceutical benefit and your medical benefit. In total, we track north of 150,000 just policy documents, so your medical policy, pharmaceutical policy, prior authorization criteria. So it's a huge subject domain, and that's really where our software comes in to track that volume of data. So we pull in the universe of policy documents, and then those customized coverage dashboards that we saw earlier, those are built out dependent on client need.
All right, that's excellent. Thank you so much, all of you, for that. We have reached the end of the question and answer portion of this webinar, but as you may have seen up on your screen, if you do have any additional questions, you can direct those to one of our speakers here, Rick Ford. His email address and phone numbers up on your screen, or you can contact Sales for Hub and Policy Reporter, Joe Abdallah, there with the email address and phone number on your screen. I encourage you to do that. Thank you, everyone, and also thank you for that Q&A session. And before you leave, be sure to download the TrialCard handout PDF on your control panel. And thank you, everyone, for participating in today's webinar. You'll be receiving a follow-up email from X-Talks with access to the recorded archive for this event. And a survey window will be popping up on your screen shortly. Your participation is appreciated as it'll help us improve our further webinars. And I'm about to send you a link in your chat box. This link will take you to where you registered for this event. You'll also be able to see the recording of that webinar right on that page. And if you have colleagues that you think might want to view this webinar as well, they can visit that page, register for the recording, and they can see that as well. So if you think that'll be useful for them, make sure to pass that along. If you found it useful, I'm sure they will as well. Well, thank you, everyone. Special thanks. I wanted to say Rick Ford, Eric Willis, and Drew Gutschmidt. Excellent presentation and excellent Q&A, guys.
Thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you so much, and we hope that you found this webinar informative today. Have a great day, everyone.